Death and the Compass is one of Jorge Luis Borges' detective stories, we could say. There's a lot of stories where characters are figuring things out along the lines of a detective, often with important reveals and twists along with the reconstruction or exposition of their reasoning. In this case, it is very explicitly a detective story. We have crimes being committed. They are part of a larger pattern which the official police don't really grasp, but this character, Eric Lönnrot, who views himself as a reasoning machine, an Auguste Dupin, he's able to grasp it, and he's able as well to ferret out the significance without knowing what the complete meaning is of clues within the background that the police themselves are not entirely getting. So it begins by saying of the many problems on which Lönnrot's reckless perspicacity was exercised, none was so strange, so rigorously strange, with rigorously in italics there, one might say, as the periodic series of bloody deeds that culminated at the Villa Triste-le-Roi amid the perpetual fragrance of the eucalyptus. Now, we do learn some interesting things at the very beginning in this first paragraph. It is true that Eric Lönnrot did not succeed in preventing the last crime, but he did indisputably foresee it. Nor did he divine the identity of Yarmolinsky's unlucky murderer. He didn't divine it, but it will be revealed to him. But he did perceive the evil series' secret shape and the part played in it by Red Scarlach, whose second sobriquet is Scarlach the Dandy. That criminal, like so many others, had sworn upon his honor to kill Lönnrot, but Lönnrot never allowed himself to be intimidated. So we've got a lot of really interesting setup there, and then we get a sequence of crimes. And it looks for a long time, and to almost everybody else, that this is a series of 3 crimes. 3 being hinted at in many ways. So the first crime takes place in the Hotel du Nord. It happens on December 3rd. And what we learn is that the delegate from Podolsk to the Third Talmudic Congress, Dr. Marcelo Yarmolinsky, a man of gray beard and gray eyes, is stabbed to death. And we learn that he was given a room on a floor across from the hall, from the suite occupied by the Tetrarch of Galilee. So, interestingly, tetra means 4, and we're going to see that come up again. And so these are some, interesting visitors. And it turns out that the Tetrarch of Galilee has quite a few very valuable stones with him. And Trevenarius is going to say, well, we all know the Tetrarch of Galilee owns the finest sapphires in the world. Someone intending to steal the sapphires broke in here by mistake. Yarmolinsky woke up the burglar, had to kill him. What do you think? So this is a perfectly reasonable set of interpretations of the data that are provided. And Lönnrot is not convinced. He says, possible but uninteresting. You will reply that reality is not the slightest obligation to be interesting. I will reply in turn that reality may get along with that obligation, but hypotheses may not. In the hypothesis you suggest, here on the spur of the moment, chance plays a disproportionate role. What we have here is a dead rabbi. I would prefer a purely rabbinical explanation, not the imaginary bunglings of an imaginary burglar. And Trevenarius says, well, I'm not interested in rabbinical explanations. I'm interested in catching the person who stabbed this man. And he calls him an unknown man. And then Lönnrot says, well, he's not unknown. we have his works here. And what are his works? Well, a row of tall books, a vindication of the Kabbalah, a study of the philosophy of Robert Flood, a literal translation of the Sefer Yetzirah, a biography of the Baal Shem, a history of the Hasidim, a monograph in German on the Tetragrammaton, another on the divine nomenclature of the Pentateuch. And the commissioner looks at them and says, I'm not interested in Jewish superstitions. And Lönnrot says, well, this crime may belong to the history of Jewish superstitions. And a writer who's there on the scene, who's an atheist, writer from the Yiddish Zeitung says, as Christianity does, belonging to the history of Jewish superstitions. Now, there is one thing that gives rise to the idea that, well, maybe this is a rabbinical explanation or crime. On a typewriter, a single line is written. The first letter of the name has been written, with name capitalized. So, Lönnrot orders the officers to wrap up the dead men's books, and he takes them to his apartment. Indifferent to the police investigation, he starts about studying them. And the writer shows up at his place a few days later. He wants to talk about the murder. What does Lönnrot want to talk about? The many names of God. Trying to pick up this sort of thing. He's looking for the broader picture. And the writer, the journalist, of course, is going to oversimplify and get things wrong and say that the famed detective Erich Lönnrot had taken up the study of the names of God in order to discover the name of the murderer, which, if that were the case, that would seem a rather odd and probably unsuccessful way to find out who committed a particular crime. Then we get a second crime. So this one is happening in the western suburbs of the city. As it's described here, the most God-forsaken of the echoing suburbs on the western outskirts of the capital. And we find that there's a man wrapped in a poncho lying in the doorway of an old paint factory. His hard face looked as though it were wearing a mask of blood. A deep knife wound split his chest. On the wall, across the red and yellow rhombuses, someone had chalked some words, which the gendarme spelled out to himself. And we'll look at those in a moment. So, who is this person? Daniel Simon Azevedo, a man of some reputation in the old slums of the north side, where he'd risen from a wagon driver to election day thug, only to degenerate thereafter into a thief and even an informer. The singular manner of his death seemed fitting. Acevedo was the last representative of a generation of outlaws who used a knife but not a revolver. And then we read those words, the second letter of the name has been written. So clearly these two crimes are connected, right? And when did this happen? January 3rd. So December 3rd, January 3rd. They could perhaps predict that another one will be happening, and we do, in fact, read the third crime took place on the night of February 3rd. A few minutes before 1, the telephone rang in Commissioner Trevenarius' office, keenly secretive. The guttural voice of a man came on the line. He told the commissioner his name was Ginsberg, and said that for a reasonable fee, he was willing to reveal certain details of the two sacrifices, Azevedo's and Yarmolinsky's. Now, this is giving, a different twist to things. These are definitely connected, and they're not merely murders, they are sacrifices. A cacophony of whistles and party horns drowned out the informer's voice. Then the line went dead. So Trevenarius makes inquiries and finds out the call had come from Liverpool House, a tavern on the Rue de Toulon, a brackish street shared by a popular museum of wonders, and a milk store, a brothel, and a company of Bible sellers. So now he telephones the owner of the place, Black Finnegan, former Irish criminal, now overwhelmed, almost crushed by irony. And Finnegan will tell him who this person was. He says that it was a person named Griffius, not Ginsberg, but it seems to be the same person, and that this was the last person to use the telephone in the tavern. And then he says he's just gone out with some friends. So the owner said 8 days earlier, Griffius, a man with sharp features, a nebulous gray beard, and a nondescript black suit, rented a room above the bar. Finnegan, who generally put the room to a used Trevenarius, had no difficulty guessing, named an exorbitant rent. Griffius unhesitatingly paid it. He almost never left the room. He had both lunch and dinner there and hardly ever showed his face in the bar. That night he'd come down to Finnegan's office to make a call. A coupe stopped in front of the tavern. The driver didn't leave the driver's seat. Some of the customers recalled he was wearing a bear mask. Two harlequin figures got out of the car. They were drunk. They burst into Finnegan's office, party horns bleeding, threw their arms around Griffius, who apparently recognized them, but greeted them somewhat coldly. They exchanged a few words in Yiddish and then went up to Griffius's room. 15 minutes later, the three men came down again, quite happy. Griffius was staggering and seemed to be as drunk as the others. So he gets put in the car, and they disappear. So this could be a kidnapping, but there's something that's scrawled by one of the harlequins. The last letter of the name has been written, which makes them think that this must be another murder. So he examines Griffius Ginsberg's little room. He finds a brusque star in blood, remains of cigarettes, a book in Latin with several handwritten notes. Lönnrot is sent for, and he starts, checking things out. And Trevenarius now is going to say something that shows that he doesn't actually know what's going on, but maybe he senses it on some level. He asks, what if tonight's story were a sham, a simulacrum? And then Lönnrot changes the subject. He points out an interesting fact about timekeeping. He says that the Jewish day begins at sundown and lasts until sundown at the following day. And the commissioner says, is that the most valuable piece of information you've picked up tonight? And Lönnrot says, no, the most valuable piece of information is the word Ginsberg used. And so now people are starting to talk about this being a series. It's happening on the 3rd of each month. And we have, the first letter, the second letter, and the last letter. Now, on March 1st, Trevenarius receives an impressive-looking sealed envelope. It contains a letter signed Baruch Spinoza, who, of course, is a major modern Jewish philosopher, right? So a stand-in for something there. And then a detailed map of the city that appears to be torn out of an atlas. What could this possibly mean? Well, the letter predicts that on the 3rd of March there would not be a fourth crime. Why? Because the paint factory in the west, the tavern on the Rue de Toulon, and the Hotel du Nord were the perfect points of a mystical equilateral triangle. So it shows it on the map. And Lönnrot looks at this, and then, this is why it's death and the compass, gets out a set of compasses. Why? Because he's figured out that the pattern hasn't been concluded. There will be a fourth. And he tells the commissioner, thanks for that equilateral triangle you sent me last night. It was what I needed to solve the puzzle. Tomorrow, Friday, the perpetrators will be in prison. We can relax. And the commissioner says, so they're not planning a fourth crime? And Lönnrot says, it's precisely because they are planning a fourth crime that we can relax. They're going to commit the crime on the 3rd, right? So he goes to the place where he has reasoned the next crime is going to be taking place. He goes to the rectangular belvedere of Villa Triste-le-Roi, which stood almost as high as the black eucalyptus trees that surrounded it. There's a rusty fence. He goes around the main gate and walks all the way around. And he says, seen at closer quarters, the house belonging to the Villa Triste-Leroy abounded in pointless symmetries and obsessive repetitions. A glacial Diana in a gloomy niche was echoed by a second Diana in a second niche. One balcony was reflected in another. Double stairways opened into a double balustrade. A two-faced Hermes threw a monstrous shadow. Now, he finds a glowing light. He goes towards a window, and there he is going to be, going inside. A stairway took him to the Belvedere, and what happens there? Two fierce, stocky men leaped on him and disarmed him. Another, quite tall, greeted him gravely. You are so kind, you saved us a night and a day. Who is it? Red Scarlach, who is sworn to kill Lönnrot like so many others. So, at first, Lönnrot doesn't understand what's going on. We read that he asks Scarlach, you are looking for the secret name? And Scarlach says, no, I'm looking for something else. Something more fleeting and more perishable than that. I'm looking for Eric Lönnrot. And then he reveals to him what the actual plot is going to be. So this shows us Lönnrot had solved the problem, but he is not solving it entirely, we might say. There's this great line, he had virtually solved the problem. The mere circumstances, the reality, names, arrests, faces, the paperwork of trial and imprisonment held very little interest for him now. Unfortunately, because they hold little interest, he is himself going to be caught up in the problem. So what is really going on? Scarlach now reveals this to us. So here we're getting the unveiling of the plot. He says, 3 years ago in a gambling den on the Rue de Toulon, you arrested my brother and saw that he was sent to prison. My men rescued me from the shootout in a coupe, but not before I'd received a policeman's bullet in my gut. 9 days and 9 nights I lay between life and death in this desolate symmetrical villa, here where we are meeting, consumed by fever. And that hateful two-faced Janus that looks towards the sunset and dawn lent horror to my deliriums and my sleeplessness. I came to abominate my own body. I came to feel that 2 eyes, 2 hands, 2 lungs are as monstrous as 2 faces. And he says, at night my delirium would grow fat upon the metaphor of an Irishman says, all roads lead to Rome. I sensed the world was a labyrinth impossible to escape. For all roads, even if they pretended to lead north or south, return finally to Rome, which was the rectangular prison where my brother lay dying, and which is also the Villa Triste-Leroy. During those nights, I swore by the God who sees with 2 faces, and by all the gods of fever and mirrors, to weave a labyrinth around the man who'd imprisoned my brother. I have woven it, and it has stood firm. Its materials are a dead heresiologue, a compass, an 8th century cult, a Greek word, a dagger, the rhombuses of a paint factory. So, part of what he did was lay into effect a plot that, was just looking for, we could say, material. And then the first term of the series is given to him, as he says, by chance. Some friends of mine, among them Daniel Azevedo, had figured out a way to steal the Tetrarch of Galilee's sapphires. Azevedo double-crossed us. He got drunk on the money and pulled the job a day early, but he got lost in that huge hotel. And sometime around 2 o'clock in the morning, he burst into Yarmolinsky's room. Yarmolinsky, who suffered from insomnia, was sitting at his typewriter writing. As coincidence would have it, he was making some notes or writing an article perhaps on the name of God. He had just typed, the first letter of the name has been written. Azevedo told him to keep quiet. Yarmolinsky put out his hand toward the bell that would wake everyone. Azevedo stabbed him in the chest. The movement was almost reflexive. He's a thug, and the easiest and simplest way is to kill. Here's what Scarlach says. 10 days later, I learned from Yiddische Zeitung you were trying to find the key to Yarmolinsky's death among Yarmolinsky's writings. I read his history of the Hasidim. I learned that the reverent fear of speaking the name of God, which has 4 letters, has been the origin of the doctrine that the name is omnipotent and occult. So, Yarmolinsky died on the night of December 3rd. I chose the 3rd of January for the second sacrifice. And who was it? Well, Acevedo, who had screwed things up, right? He says, I wrote the second letter of the name across the rhombuses of the paint factory. The third crime was actually the murder, not actual murder, of Red Scarlach, disguised as Griffius Ginsburg. And he says, I spent all that time there, and then one of my friends kidnapped me and wrote the last letter of the name has been written. And he says, this revealed it was a series of 3 crimes. That's how the man in the street interpreted it. But I dropped clues so that you, the reasoning Eric Lönnrot, would realize there were actually 4. 1 sign in the north, 2 more in the east and west. Demand another sign in the south. After all, the tetragrammaton, the name of God, consists of 4 letters. The harlequins in the paint manufacturer's emblem suggest 4 terms. It was I who underlined the passage in Leuston's book, the passage that says that Jews compute the day from sunset to sunset. The passage, therefore, gives one to understand that the deaths occurred on the 4th of each month, so there should be 4 deaths. He says, it was I who sent the equilateral triangle to Traverius. I knew that you would add the missing point, the point that makes a perfect rhombus, a 4-sided figure, right? The point that fixes the place where a precise death awaits you. I have done all this, Eric Lönnrot planned all this in order to draw you to the solitudes of Triste-le-Roi. So the great detective has effectively been deceived, foiled, and now will be killed by his nemesis, who shows himself as actually being his nemesis, one of many people who wants to kill him, the one who succeeds, and only succeeds because he outthinks the brilliant detective. Now, Lönnrot says to him something, and this is where the story is going to close. He says, there are 3 lines too many in your labyrinth. I know of a Greek labyrinth that is just but 1 straight line. So we're talking about Zeno's paradoxes there. So many philosophers have been lost on that line. A mere detective might be pardoned if he became lost as well. When you hunt me down in another avatar of our lives, Sherlock, I submit that you fake or commit 1 crime at A, a second crime at B, 8 kilometers from A, then a third crime at C, 4 kilometers from B, and halfway between them. Then wait for me at D, 2 kilometers from A and C, and once halfway between them. Kill me at D, as you're about to kill me at Triste-le-Roi. So we've got a reworking of Zeno's paradox, rather. And Sherlock says, well, yes, the next time I kill you, I promise you a labyrinth that consists of a single straight line that is invisible and endless. And then he fires, kills the detective. So this is kind of a strange detective story. The detective doesn't win, right? The crime occurs, and the detective himself is the victim of the final crime that he has succeeded in cracking the code for and predicting, not realizing that he himself is the intended victim. So Red Scarlach is the one who actually triumphs in this case.